It's 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 1959. Frank Sinatra is driving alone on the Pacific Coast Highway, somewhere between San Francisco and nowhere. The fog is so thick he can barely see 10 feet ahead. His dual-gear coupe crawls along the cliffside road, headlights swallowed by the mist. He's tired. 3 shows in 2 days. His throat is raw. His mind is racing. He reaches for the radio dial. Static. He turns it slowly, searching for any station, any voice to fill the silence. And then he finds one. A song begins to play. His song. In the wee small hours of the morning. But something is wrong. The voice singing is his. The arrangement is familiar. But there's a verse he doesn't recognize. Words he never wrote. Words he never sang. Frank pulls the car to the shoulder. He leans closer to the radio, his breath fogging the glass of the dashboard. The song continues. It's definitely his voice. But the lyrics are impossible. And then the voice on the radio says something that makes Frank Sinatra's blood run cold. It says his name. It says it like a warning. What happened over the next 3 hours would become one of the strangest, most closely guarded secrets of Frank Sinatra's life. A night he never spoke about publicly. A night that shook the unshakable man to his core. To understand what happened on that fog-choked highway, you need to understand who Frank Sinatra was in 1959. He wasn't just a singer. He was the most powerful entertainer in America. The comeback was complete. The Academy Award for From Here to Eternity had erased the memory of the early 50s slump. Capitol Records couldn't press his albums fast enough. The Rat Pack was forming, a brotherhood of cool that would define a generation. Frank Sinatra was on top of the world. But Frank Sinatra was also a man running from something. Multiple somethings, actually. The ghosts of Hoboken, the violence of his father, the guilt of the women he'd hurt. Ava Gardner had left him, and that wound still bled. He filled the void with power, with control, with an entourage that followed his every command. San Francisco in 1959 was a city of fog and secrets. The beat poets were redefining literature in North Beach coffeehouses. The mob ran the waterfront, and the radio waves were a battlefield. Pirate stations broadcasting from ships in the bay, unlicensed operators pushing signals through the gray mist that rolled in every night. Frank had been in town for a series of shows at the Fairmont Hotel. The performances were legendary. Standing ovations every night. But Frank was exhausted. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He'd been drinking. And instead of staying at the hotel like his manager begged him to, he'd decided to drive. He needed to be alone. He needed the road. He needed to outrun whatever was chasing him inside his own head. The Pacific Coast Highway at night is a dangerous thing. Cliffs on one side, ocean on the other, fog that appears without warning. It's the kind of road that swallows people. The kind of road where reality feels thin. Frank didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in the supernatural. He believed in talent, money, and the right people owing you favors. But as he drove through that fog, something was waiting for him. Frank Sinatra, in November 1959, was a contradiction in motion. On stage, he was magnetic. He could hold a note like he was holding a woman, tender and dangerous at the same time. His phrasing was impeccable. His timing was supernatural. When Frank Sinatra sang, the world leaned in to listen. But off stage, he was a live wire. His temper was legendary. He'd thrown a phone through a hotel window in Chicago the week before. He'd fired his valet for bringing the wrong shade of orange juice. He kept a list of enemies in his head, and that list was long. Those close to him knew about the insomnia. Frank rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours. He prowled his hotel suites at night, watching old movies, making phone calls to people in different time zones just to hear a voice. The darkness scared him. Not the literal darkness, but the silence that came with it. The moment when there was no crowd, no music, no distraction, and Frank Sinatra had to sit alone with Frank Sinatra. His driver, a quiet man named Jimmy Iovine Sr., had begged him not to take the car out that night. "Mr. S., the fog is murder out there. Wait until morning." But Frank had given him that look. The look that ended conversations. "I need to drive, Jimmy. I'll see you in L.A." So Frank drove, alone, through the fog, with nothing but a radio that couldn't find a signal. Until it did. The first sign that something was wrong came at 2:30 a.m. Frank noticed his gas gauge dropping faster than it should. He'd filled up before leaving San Francisco. The needle was at half a tank when he started. Now, 30 minutes later, it was nearly empty. Impossible. The math didn't work. He pulled into a service station in Pacifica. It was closed. The lights were off. But as he sat there, engine idling, he saw something strange. Through the fog, in the window of the station, a figure was standing, watching him. Frank squinted. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silhouette barely visible through the mist. Frank honked his horn. Nothing. He flashed his headlights. The figure remained still. Frank Sinatra didn't scare easy, but his hand was shaking when he put the car back in drive and pulled away. That's when the radio found the signal. At first it was just music, a jazz arrangement he didn't recognize. Then the melody shifted, and he heard the opening notes of "In the Wee Small Hours." His song, his voice. Frank relaxed. Just a late-night station playing his records. Nothing strange about that. He was Frank Sinatra. His songs were everywhere. But then, the lyrics changed. The first verse was normal. "In the wee small hours of the morning, while the whole wide world is fast asleep." But the second verse was wrong. The words didn't match. Frank leaned forward, turning up the volume. His own voice sang, "In the wee small hours of morning, when the dreams have turned to dust, you'll remember what you buried. You'll remember what you lost." Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. That wasn't his lyric. He'd never sung those words. He'd never recorded them. But that was his voice, his exact phrasing, his vibrato. The song continued. More wrong lyrics. Lyrics about guilt, about debt, about a reckoning that was coming. And then the song ended, and a voice spoke. "Francis Albert Sinatra." Frank stopped breathing. "We know what you did in Havana. We know about the money. We know about the girl." The voice was calm, almost gentle. It wasn't threatening. It was stating facts. And then it said something that made Frank's blood freeze solid. "Turn around, Francis. Go back, or we'll play the tape. Everyone will hear. Everyone will know." The radio cut to static. Frank pulled the car to the side of the road. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. The world had shrunk to the size of this car, this radio, this moment. His first instinct was anger. Someone was playing games with him. Someone had rigged the radio. It was a prank. It had to be. Maybe one of Dean's stunts gone too far. Maybe a rival trying to rattle him before a negotiation. But the voice had mentioned Havana. Frank closed his eyes. Havana. 1946, the famous trip, the meeting with Lucky Luciano. The suitcase everyone whispered about, but nobody could prove. The photograph that almost ended his career. And the girl. There had been a girl. There was always a girl. But this one had been different. This one had consequences he'd paid dearly to make disappear. How did they know? Frank grabbed the radio dial and turned it, searching for the station again. Static, static, more static. He couldn't find it. The signal was gone. He slammed his hand against the dashboard. "Who are you?" he shouted into the empty car. "What do you want?" Silence. And then, impossibly, the radio crackled back to life. The voice returned. But this time it wasn't speaking. It was singing. His voice. Singing a song he'd never recorded. The voice of the night knows your name, Francis. The voice of the night sees your shame. You can run down the coast, you can hide in the light, but you'll never escape from the voice of the night. Frank ripped the radio from the dashboard. He tore it out with his bare hands, wires sparking, his fingers bleeding. He threw it into the passenger seat. The singing continued. It was coming from outside the car now, from the fog itself, from everywhere. Frank Sinatra, the man who stared down mobsters, who told studio heads to go to hell, who bent the world to his will, did something he hadn't done since he was a boy in Hoboken. He prayed. "Please," he whispered. "Please stop." The singing stopped. The fog began to lift, just slightly. Enough for Frank to see the road ahead. Enough for him to see a sign he hadn't noticed before. Point Reyes Station, 15 miles. He wasn't where he thought he was. He'd been driving south toward LA, but somehow, impossibly, he was north of San Francisco now. He'd been driving in the wrong direction for hours without knowing it. Frank Sinatra sat there for a long time. The destroyed radio smoked gently in the passenger seat. His hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked with sweat. And then he did what the voice told him to do. He turned around. Frank arrived back in San Francisco at dawn. He checked into the Fairmont without speaking to anyone. He locked himself in his suite for 2 days. When he finally emerged, he was different. Those who knew him noticed it immediately. The explosive temper was still there. But it was quieter now, more controlled, as if something had taught him that there were things in the world bigger than his anger. He never spoke about that night. Not to Dean, not to Sammy, not to anyone in the Rat Pack. He told his manager he'd had car trouble. He told the press nothing. But in the weeks that followed, Frank made some changes. He quietly paid off a debt he'd been avoiding in Chicago. He sent money to an address in Havana, care of a name nobody knew. He destroyed certain photographs and papers he'd kept in a safe deposit box. And he never drove the Pacific Coast Highway alone at night again. Years later, in 1971, a radio engineer named Thomas Morrow published an article in a small technical journal about ghost stations, phantom signals that appeared on the AM band during certain atmospheric conditions. He theorized that radio waves could bounce off temperature inversions in fog, creating echoes that seemed to come from nowhere. But that didn't explain the lyrics. That didn't explain how the voice knew Frank's secrets. That didn't explain how Frank had driven north for 3 hours while believing he was heading south. Some mysteries don't want to be solved. Frank Sinatra lived another 39 years after that night. He became more famous, more powerful, the chairman of the board. But people who knew him well said there was always a part of Frank that seemed to be listening for something, especially at night, especially in the fog. What happened on the Pacific Coast Highway in November 1959? Was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and alcohol? Was it some elaborate hoax by enemies trying to break him? Was it something else entirely, something that defies rational explanation? The truth is, we don't know. And maybe that's the point. Frank Sinatra built his legend on control. He controlled his voice, his band, his entourage, his empire. He bent the world to his will through sheer force of personality. But that night, he encountered something he couldn't control. Something that knew his secrets. Something that reminded him that even the most powerful men have vulnerabilities they can never escape. The lesson isn't about ghosts or radio signals or the supernatural. The lesson is about guilt, about the weight we carry, about the things we bury that refuse to stay buried. Frank Sinatra spent his life running from Hoboken, running from failure, running from the quiet moments when there was no music and no crowd, and he had to face himself. That night on the highway, he couldn't run anymore. The fog stopped him. The voice stopped him. And for one terrifying moment, Albert Sinatra had to reckon with who he really was. He turned around. He went back. He made amends where he could. Maybe that's what the voice wanted all along. We all have our own Pacific Coast Highway. We all have our own fog. And somewhere out there, in the static between stations, there's a voice that knows our name. The question isn't whether we'll hear it. The question is what we'll do when we finally do. This is the story of the night Frank Sinatra heard a song that didn't exist on a station nobody could find. It's not in the biographies, but it's part of his legacy. The part that reminds us that even legends have moments when control fails, when the chairman of the board becomes just another man alone in the dark. This was Frank Sinatra, Legacy Confidential. If this story made you think twice about driving alone at night, hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves mysteries hidden in plain sight. Tell us in the comments, have you ever heard something you couldn't explain? We all have secrets. The only question is, who's listening? Subscribe now. The next story goes even deeper. Until then, watch the fog.